Rose sat at her vanity table, brushing her hair slowly, lost in thought. The evening air was quiet, too quiet. She couldn't shake the heavy feeling in her chest. For weeks now, Daniel had been distant, coming home late, avoiding her gaze, and offering one-word answers when she tried to talk to him. Tonight, her gut told her something wasn't right. She had seen the way Rebecca, her secretary, had lingered too long in conversations with Daniel, how her laughter was a little too loud, her hand brushing his arm too often. Rose had dismissed it at first. Rebecca was young, beautiful, and bold, but Rose thought she trusted her husband. Her hand froze mid-brush when her phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from an unknown number, a single photo attached. Rose's breath caught in her throat as she opened it. It was a picture of Daniel and Rebecca at a restaurant, their faces close, their smiles intimate. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the phone. Tears blurred her vision, but she pushed them away. She needed to hear the truth from him. When Daniel walked through the door that evening, his tie was loose, and he carried the faint smell of Rebecca's floral perfume. Rose stood in the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. He glanced at her briefly, then dropped his keys on the table. "Out," he said flatly. "Out with Rebecca?" At the sound of Rebecca's name, his head snapped up. For a moment he looked caught, but then his face hardened. "And if I was?" he asked, his tone defensive. Rose's chest tightened. "So it's true? You've been seeing her behind my back?" Daniel sighed and ran a hand through his hair, clearly annoyed. "Yes, Rose, I have. And before you start, let me say this. I want more from life. I want a child, a real family. Rebecca can give me that." Rose's knees buckled, and she stumbled back, gripping the arm of the couch for support. "I'm your wife," she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel didn't soften. And that was enough for a while, but not any more. He walked past her, heading toward the stairs. "Rebecca is pregnant. She's moving in tomorrow. You need to leave." The words struck like a blow to her chest. Rose's mind raced, struggling to process what he had just said. "You're kicking me out?" "Yes." He turned at the foot of the stairs, his expression cold. "There's nothing left here for us. It's over." Rose stared at him, her lips trembling, but no words came. She felt the weight of his betrayal crush her, leaving her numb. Slowly, she walked to their bedroom and began packing. Every item she folded into the suitcase felt like another piece of her broken heart. As she zipped the suitcase closed, she looked around the room one last time. The memories of their laughter, their plans for the future, and the love she thought they shared all seemed like distant lies now. With her head held high, she carried her suitcase down the stairs and walked out the door. Rose stared at the darkened street outside as she walked, suitcase in hand, her steps heavy with the weight of Daniel's betrayal. The cool air bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold emptiness she felt inside. The streets were quiet, much like the silence that had filled her home these past few months, a silence that had been the harbinger of her broken marriage. She paused under a flickering streetlight, her fingers gripping the handle of her suitcase tightly. The night felt hauntingly familiar, dredging up memories she had spent years trying to bury. This wasn't the first time she had felt abandoned, left to pick up the pieces of her life. As a child, Rose had learned the meaning of loss far too early. She was only 8 when her parents died in a car crash, leaving her orphaned and adrift. The days that followed were a blur of grief and confusion. She remembered clinging to her mother's scarf, the faint scent of her perfume fading with each passing day. Rose's small world shattered further when she was sent to Kumasi to live with her Aunt Vivian. At first, she had held on to the hope that her aunt's house would offer some semblance of warmth and comfort, but Vivian wasn't nurturing. She was distant, stern, and quick to remind Rose of the burden she had become. "You're lucky I took you in," Vivian would say whenever Rose faltered under the weight of her duties. School, housework, and errands left little time for Rose to grieve or just be a child. Nights were the hardest. Curled up on the worn mattress in the corner of her room, Rose cried silently into her pillow, longing for the love and safety she had once known. Despite her circumstances, Rose found solace in her studies. School became her escape, a place where her efforts were acknowledged and her dreams nurtured. Her teachers praised her diligence, fueling her determination to rise above her circumstances. At 18, Rose got her chance. She earned a scholarship to a university in Accra and left home without looking back. The day she packed her bags, Aunt Vivian barely said goodbye, offering only a dismissive wave and a reminder not to come crawling back if life got hard. Rose walked away with nothing but a suitcase, a head full of dreams, and a heart longing for freedom. In Accra, Rose thrived. The city's energy and opportunities filled her with hope. She worked part-time jobs while studying, scraping by but never complaining. For the first time, she felt like her life was her own. Though she was finally free, the scars of her childhood ran deep. Rose struggled to trust people, and she avoided contact with her family entirely, unwilling to reopen old wounds. What sustained her, however, was her dream of one day creating the family she never had. She longed for a home filled with love and laughter, children running through the halls, and a partner who would cherish her unconditionally. When Rose met Daniel in her late 20s, she believed she had found that dream. He was charming, supportive, and seemed to want the same things she did: a big family, a loving home, and a future filled with possibilities. For a while, she thought her prayers had been answered. Their wedding had been the talk of Accra, simple yet elegant, filled with laughter, joy, and promises of a lifetime together. Rose had never felt so certain about anything as she did about Daniel. Their early years were blissful. Rose worked as an administrator at a small law firm, where her knack for organization and attention to detail made her indispensable. Daniel, ambitious and driven, managed his family's logistics company. They shared a beautiful home, filled with warmth and plans for the future. In the beginning, their dreams revolved around each other. Weekend trips, late-night conversations about their goals, and quiet evenings curled up on the couch made life feel perfect. Rose loved Daniel deeply and believed he loved her the same way. But after 2 years, conversations about starting a family became more frequent. Daniel wanted children, and so did Rose. They had tried, month after month, but with no success. What started as hopeful excitement soon turned into a silent struggle. "You shouldn't stress yourself, Rose," Daniel would say, kissing her forehead after another disappointing doctor's visit. "It'll happen when it's meant to." At first, his words reassured her. They both underwent tests, and though nothing was definitively wrong, the months stretched into years. Rose started to feel the weight of disappointment and shame. It didn't help that Daniel's mother had begun to make her disapproval known. During one family gathering, she leaned in close to Rose and said, "You've been married long enough, my dear. When are you giving us grandchildren? Time is not on your side." Rose forced a smile, but her heart sank. That night she cried silently in bed while Daniel snored beside her. He never defended her against the subtle jabs from his family, and slowly Rose began to feel like she was failing him. The tension grew worse when Rebecca entered their lives. Rose had hired her as a secretary at the firm after being impressed by her efficiency and charm. Rebecca was quick to smile, always dressed sharply, and seemed eager to please. At first, Rose appreciated her work ethic and treated her kindly. Rebecca was younger, with an easy confidence that Rose sometimes envied. She had a way of making everyone around her feel important, including Daniel. Rose noticed how Rebecca would linger in conversations with him during office parties, or how her laughter rang a little louder when he was near. "You should be careful about Rebecca," Rose's friend Amma once said after an event. "She's too friendly with your husband." Rose had waved it off. "Daniel wouldn't do that to me," she said, though the words felt more like a hope than a certainty. As the months passed, Daniel began to change. He started coming home late, claiming work had been hectic. His once affectionate demeanour grew colder, and he often seemed distracted, his phone always in his hand. One night, as they lay in bed, Rose reached out to him. "Daniel, are you okay? You've been so distant lately." "I'm fine," he replied curtly, turning his back to her. She stared at the ceiling, fighting the growing unease in her chest. She tried to convince herself it was all in her head, that the man she married would never betray her. But deep down, a part of her knew the truth. The photograph she received that fateful night confirmed what her heart had already suspected. Her world, built on love and trust, began to crumble, leaving her standing on unsteady ground. Now, standing under the dim light, Rose's lips tightened as the old memories collided with the present. Back when she was a child, she had vowed to build a life far removed from her aunt's cold disdain. She had succeeded, carving out a career and a seemingly stable life in Accra. She thought she had finally found what she had longed for: love, stability, and the family she had always dreamed of. But tonight, it felt as though the universe had conspired to remind her that nothing was permanent. She drew in a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She had been here before, lost, heartbroken, and forced to start over. And just as she had back then, she would rise again. This time, though, she wouldn't simply survive. She would thrive. Rose picked up her suitcase and walked into the night, the city lights stretching before her like distant stars. Rose's days after Daniel kicked her out of the house were some of the darkest of her life. With nowhere else to go, she moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Accra. The place was bare, with peeling paint and a creaky ceiling fan that barely worked. It wasn't much, but it was all she could afford. The first few days felt surreal, as if she were living someone else's life. She often sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the single suitcase she had brought with her. It contained the few belongings she had managed to grab in her rush to leave. Among them was a framed wedding photo of her and Daniel, which she placed face down on the small bedside table. Mornings were the hardest. Rose would wake up, and for a brief moment forget everything that had happened. But reality would hit her as soon as she opened her eyes to the unfamiliar walls of the apartment. She had no husband, no home, and the life she had worked so hard to build was gone. Her job became her only constant. Rose buried herself in work, arriving early and staying late to avoid going back to her empty apartment. She was efficient, polite, and professional, but inside she was barely holding it together. At lunchtime she often sat alone at her desk, nibbling at a sandwich she didn't really taste. Her evenings were lonely and quiet. She would make herself a simple meal, usually rice or noodles, then sit on the couch with the TV on for background noise. She rarely watched anything, her mind instead replaying the betrayal and heartbreak she had endured. Sometimes she couldn't stop the tears. She cried in the shower, in the middle of cooking, and even as she tried to fall asleep. It wasn't just the loss of her marriage that hurt. It was the deep sense of rejection. Daniel's words echoed in her mind. "Rebecca is pregnant. She's moving in tomorrow." Meanwhile, across town, Daniel's life seemed to sparkle with a vibrancy that was utterly absent from Rose's. Rebecca had moved into the house almost immediately after Rose left. Life with Rebecca felt like a dream come true for Daniel. After years of tension and disappointment in his marriage with Rose, being with Rebecca brought a sense of excitement and freedom he hadn't felt in a long time. Everything seemed perfect, or at least, that's what Daniel wanted to believe. Rebecca wasted no time making changes to the house, rearranging furniture, hanging new curtains, and redecorating to her taste. She wanted to erase every trace of Rose, and make the house truly hers. "This place needs a woman's touch," Rebecca said as she hung a vibrant painting on the wall. "A fresh start for both of us." Daniel, eager to please her, nodded. He thought their life together was finally falling into place. Rebecca seemed happy, and with her pregnancy progressing, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He imagined a future filled with the sounds of a child's laughter, family outings, and the pride of being a father. The prospect of finally having the family he'd always wanted overshadowed any lingering guilt about how his relationship with Rose had ended. A few weeks after Rebecca moved in, she introduced Daniel to her brother, Mark. "This is my brother," Rebecca said casually one afternoon as Mark walked into their home with a confident smile. "He's just visiting for a few days." Mark was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with an air of charm that instantly made Daniel feel a little uneasy, but Daniel dismissed it, chalking it up to nerves about having someone new in their space. Mark began visiting frequently, always bringing Rebecca small gifts, her favourite snacks, flowers, or little trinkets. Daniel noticed how Rebecca's face lit up whenever Mark arrived, how their conversations were filled with laughter and inside jokes that excluded him. "Your brother sure comes around a lot," Daniel commented one evening as Rebecca cleared the dinner table. "He's family," she said with a shrug, avoiding his eyes. "We've always been close." Daniel nodded, though a faint sense of unease lingered. He reminded himself not to be suspicious. Rebecca was carrying his child, and he trusted her. Or at least he wanted to. While Daniel and Rebecca were living what seemed like the perfect life, Rose continued to feel the pain of the betrayal. She spent all her time in her tiny apartment and avoided her old social circle, too ashamed to face the whispers and pity she feared would follow her. Even Amma, her closest friend, had to insist before Rose agreed to meet for coffee one afternoon. "Rose, you can't keep this all inside," Amma said, reaching across the table to hold her hand. "I don't know how to move on," Rose admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Amma gave her a firm look. "One day at a time. And remember, this doesn't define you. You're stronger than you think." Those words stayed with Rose. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave her something to hold on to. Slowly, she began to piece her life back together. She started taking evening walks around the neighborhood, letting the fresh air clear her mind. She picked up a few books from a street vendor and spent her weekends reading, letting the stories transport her to a world far from her own. Though the days were still difficult, a tiny seed of hope began to grow within her. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to find her footing again, one small step at a time. It was a hot afternoon in Accra, and Rose was running late for a doctor's appointment. As she turned into the busy parking lot, she spotted a free space near the entrance. Her heart leapt in relief as she signalled and began to manoeuvre her car into the spot. At the same time, a sleek black car approached from the opposite direction and darted forward. It slid halfway into the spot before Rose could fully pull in. She slammed on the brakes, her mouth dropping open in disbelief. "What the?" Rose muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She shifted into park and stepped out of her car, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement. The driver of the other car, a tall man with a confident stride, emerged as well, looking equally annoyed. "Excuse me," Rose said, hands on her hips. "I was here first. You can't just swoop in like that." The man, Alex, raised an eyebrow and gestured toward his car. "Swoop in? I think we both saw the spot at the same time." "But I had my signal on," Rose countered, her tone sharp. "It's basic courtesy. Ever heard of it?" Alex sighed, crossing his arms. "Look, I'm not trying to start a fight here, but technically I was halfway in before you even started turning." Rose's frustration bubbled over. "Technically you're being rude, and technically you should reverse." Alex chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Wow, you're really making a thing out of this, huh?" "Only because you're in the wrong," Rose shot back. "I don't have time for this. I have an appointment." "Funny, so do I," Alex replied, his voice calm but firm. They stood there for a moment, locked in a silent standoff. A car honked in the distance, and the heat of the afternoon made everything feel heavier. Finally, Alex threw up his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, walking back to his car. "You win. Take the spot." Rose blinked, surprised by his sudden retreat. "Really?" "Yes, really," Alex replied, sliding into his car with an exasperated sigh. He reversed slowly, leaving the spot open. Before he drove off, he rolled down his window. "I hope your appointment goes well. Next time, though, maybe try smiling. It suits you." Rose's jaw tightened as he drove away, but a small part of her couldn't help but replay his words. She parked her car, muttering under her breath as she walked into the building. Who did he think he was, giving her attitude and then offering a backhanded compliment? She brushed it off, determined not to let it ruin her day. Fate, however, wasn't done with them. A week later, Rose was leaving the grocery store when she spotted a familiar black car pulling into the parking lot. Alex stepped out, holding a shopping list in one hand and a reusable bag in the other. Their eyes met and recognition flickered between them. Alex smirked and gave her a small wave. "Well, if it isn't the parking spot warrior." Rose rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the faintest smile. "And if it isn't the guy who doesn't know how to share." Alex laughed, the tension from their first meeting melting away. "Truce?" he asked, holding out a hand. Rose hesitated, then shook it. "Truce? But don't think I've forgotten." "Wouldn't dream of it," Alex said, grinning. After their initial meeting at the parking lot and the store, Alex and Rose continued to run into each other unexpectedly. Each time their exchanges grew warmer, their conversations longer, and their laughs more frequent. What began as an irritating coincidence started to feel like fate gently nudging them together. While Rose was slowly rebuilding her life, Daniel's perfect new world began to show cracks. At first, things with Rebecca were exciting. She was lively, affectionate, and constantly reminded him how much she needed him, but as her pregnancy progressed, her behavior shifted. It became worse after she had the baby. She started staying out late, brushing off Daniel's questions with vague excuses. "Where were you last night?" he asked one evening when she walked in well past midnight. "With my brother," Rebecca said casually, setting her purse down. Daniel frowned. Something about the way she said it didn't sit right. Her brother had been around a lot lately, helping with errands, picking her up from places, even dropping by the house unannounced. Daniel didn't like it, but whenever he brought it up, Rebecca would laugh it off. "Don't be ridiculous," she'd say, her tone dismissive. "He's family." But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One afternoon, when Rebecca left for a doctor's appointment, Daniel decided to follow her. He trailed her car through the bustling streets of Accra until she stopped at a small cafe. From his car he watched as she walked in and sat down across from her so-called brother. What he saw next made his blood run cold. Rebecca leaned forward laughing and touched the man's hand affectionately. They looked nothing like siblings. Daniel's chest tightened as realization hit him. He stormed into the cafe, his face red with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to draw attention. Rebecca's face froze, but only for a moment. Then, to Daniel's shock, she smirked. "You want the truth?" she said, crossing her arms. "This is the father of my baby." Daniel's heart dropped. "What? But you said—" "I said what you wanted to hear," she interrupted, her tone mocking. "You were an easy mark, Daniel. I needed a roof over my head and someone to spoil me. And you? You fell for it." Her words hit like daggers. Daniel stood there, stunned, as Rebecca grabbed her bag and walked out with the man, leaving him alone in the cafe, his perfect life shattered. Back at her apartment, Rose was beginning to smile again. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, unaware that Daniel's life was crumbling just as hers was blooming. Over the next few months, Rose and Alex began meeting intentionally. It started with simple coffee dates and grew into evening walks through the park, long conversations about life, and movie nights at Rose's apartment. Alex was patient, never pushing her to reveal more than she was comfortable with, but always there when she needed support. One evening, Alex asked Rose to marry her. Their wedding was a simple yet beautiful ceremony surrounded by close friends. Then one morning Rose woke up feeling strange. Her body ached, and she felt an odd nausea she couldn't explain. At first, she thought it was stress catching up to her, but when the feeling persisted, she decided to visit the doctor. Sitting in the sterile waiting room, her mind raced with possibilities. When the doctor finally called her in, he smiled warmly. "Congratulations, Mrs. Rose," he said, handing her a printout of the test results. "You're pregnant." Rose stared at the paper, her hands trembling. "Pregnant?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. About 6 weeks along," the doctor confirmed. Tears streamed down her face as she left the clinic, but this time they were tears of joy. She immediately called Alex and gave him the good news. There was a long pause before Alex burst out, "Rose, that's amazing!" Hearing the genuine excitement in his voice made Rose smile. "I didn't think this could happen," she admitted. "Well, now we know miracles happen," Alex said warmly. "Let's celebrate. Dinner tonight, my treat." Across town, Daniel's life was falling apart. After Rebecca's betrayal, he felt empty and lost. His house, once filled with laughter and love, was now eerily quiet. Work no longer brought him satisfaction, and his friends grew distant as they tired of his complaints. One evening, while walking through a crowded market, Daniel spotted Rose. She was glowing, her hand resting lightly on her growing belly, and Alex was beside her, carrying bags and laughing at something she'd said. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched them. He wanted to call out to her, but shame kept him rooted in place. He realized too late what he had lost. "Are you okay, sir?" a vendor asked, noticing Daniel's dazed expression. He shook his head and walked away, his mind heavy with regret. One day, Rose was sitting at home, her hand resting on her stomach as she felt her baby kick for the first time. Alex came over, sat beside her, and asked gently, "Do you ever think about him?" "Sometimes," Rose admitted, her voice steady, "but not with anger anymore. What happened needed to happen. It brought me here, to you, and to this baby." Alex smiled, squeezing her hand. "I'm glad you see it that way." As Rose leaned against him, she realized that her past no longer defined her. The pain and betrayal had shaped her, but it didn't hold her back. She was finally free to embrace her new life, full of love and possibilities. The day Rose gave birth was bright and sunny, as if the universe itself was celebrating her new beginning. She held her newborn son in her arms, his tiny fingers curling around hers, and felt an overwhelming wave of love and gratitude. Alex sat by her hospital bed, his eyes misty as he looked at their child. "He's perfect," Alex whispered, brushing a soft kiss against Rose's forehead. Rose nodded, her eyes never leaving her son. "I never thought I'd feel this happy again," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You deserve this, Rose," Alex replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. The journey hadn't been easy, but this moment made every struggle worth it. Rose's heart felt full, her life transformed by the love and support she had found in Alex, and now in her baby boy. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone in the living room of the house he once shared with Rose. The air felt stale, the silence unbearable. He stared at an old photo of the two of them, taken during a trip to the national park in happier times. They were smiling, carefree, and in love. He placed the photo back on the table and buried his face in his hands. Since Rebecca had left, his life had been a series of disappointments. The logistics business was struggling, and his relationships with friends and family had frayed. He often thought of Rose and the life they could have had if he hadn't been so blinded by his own selfishness. One afternoon, while running errands in Accra, Daniel saw Rose again. She was walking through the market with Alex and their baby. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Rose looked radiant, her laughter ringing out as she adjusted the baby's blanket. Alex carried a basket of fruits, smiling at her with a tenderness Daniel now realized he had never given her. Daniel hesitated, torn between the desire to approach her and the shame of what he had done. But as he stepped forward, Rose turned slightly and caught his eye. For a moment, their gazes met. Her expression wasn't angry or bitter. It was calm, even kind. She gave him a small, polite nod before turning her attention back to Alex and the baby. That simple gesture told Daniel everything. She had moved on, and she was happy. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more great content. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to share this video with someone who might enjoy it too. See you in the next one.